To most people, George Washington is a Revolutionary War hero, the first president of the United States, and a very honest little boy you wouldn't want near your cherry trees. But was Washington, the man, really the virtuous figure the myths and legends make him out to be? Well, today we're going to take a look at what George Washington's private life was really like. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below which famous U.S. historical figures you would like to hear about. Okay, we cannot tell a lie, so let's tell you about George Washington. We're used to picturing George Washington as an older gentleman with white hair and false teeth, but he was once a young man, and like a lot of young men, he had an eye for the ladies. At 27, George became engaged to a young widow named Martha Dandridge Custis, who would become his famous wife, Martha Washington. However, while he was planning his wedding to this wealthy landowner's daughter, he was also writing romantic letters to a married woman named Sally Fairfax. Oh, George, you sly fox. In one of the letters, dated September 12, 1758, Washington told Sally that he remained devoted to a lady. In the parlance of the times, this was a way of implying his forbidden love for her. Because circumstances kept them apart, the lovelorn and surprisingly poetic Washington went on to say of Fairfax, "I feel the force of her amiable beauties in the recollection of 1,000 tender passages that I could wish to obliterate." The letter also acknowledged Martha in slightly less poetic terms, calling her an animating prospect. The truth was, however, Washington was entering into marriage with Martha for reasons having to do with social convention and economic prospects rather than love. Fairfax, for her part, kept George's letter until the end of her life. When George and Martha were married in 1759, Martha brought her two surviving children, Jackie and Patsy, to the union. Washington chose to raise the children as his own, and by all accounts was a doting, loving parent. It's even known that he ordered special toys from London for the two kids. Tragically, the children both died at relatively young ages. Patsy passed away at 17 from complications arising from epilepsy, while Jackie died of a sudden illness shortly before his 27th birthday. George and Martha never had any children of their own. George Washington was 11 years old when he inherited his first slaves, and by the end of his life, records reflect he had enslaved 317 people. During the 56 years he ran his plantation, many attempted to escape. This even happened during the American Revolution, when, ironically, 17 of George Washington's slaves fled to a British warship to gain their freedom, which was not on the agenda in America at that time. Contrary to the image of all being happy and contented, many of the slaves who were closest to Washington and his family, including George's personal assistant, Martha's personal maid, and the family cook, all either escaped or attempted to escape from Mount Vernon. However, it's true that in his will, Washington instructed that all the slaves he owned outright under the law should be freed, which actually only included 123 of the 317 slaves the family managed. And Washington stipulated that they only should be freed after Martha died. America's founding fathers were a long way from perfect, and it is known that several of them had multiple children with women who were enslaved on their plantations. In Washington's case, however, the historical record is not very clear. Debate continues to this very day over whether the father of the United States also fathered a child with a woman named Venus. The child in question was named West Ford, which sounds like a great name for a movie cowboy. Ford was born in the 1780s, and according to one of his descendants, his mother Venus was known to be Washington's personal sleep partner. Who's that in bed with you? Nothing to see here, it's just my personal sleep partner. Family lore holds that when it was obvious she had become pregnant, Washington no longer slept with her. It's also said that several people commented on how much Ford looked like Washington, and Venus identified Washington as his father. Other historians, though, doubt that lore. They pointed to evidence that Venus couldn't have arrived at Mount Vernon until the year after West Ford was born. Moreover, it's known from his letters that Washington wanted children. His failure to produce an heir with Martha, who had 4 children of her own, suggests he may have been sterile. Such a condition could easily have been a result of one of his earlier bouts with smallpox or tuberculosis. DNA testing, unfortunately, seems unlikely to settle this one. We don't have enough of Washington's DNA to test, but even if there was, it wouldn't really matter. West Ford's body, which was buried in an unmarked grave with 50 other people, has been effectively lost. Not being huge fans of George Washington, several British officials tried their hardest to destroy his reputation by starting scandalous rumors about his character and faithfulness to his wife. In 1775, a Boston newspaper reported that Britain's Royal Navy had intercepted a letter about General Washington's private life. Supposedly, it claimed that a Virginia congressman had procured one Kate, the washerwoman's daughter over the way, for the general to sleep with. The letter is believed to have been forged in an attempt to smear Washington. Another British group tried something similar in 1777. This time, they created fake trial transcripts that recorded a soldier testifying that Washington kept a girl from New Jersey of whom he was very fond as his mistress and hid the affair from his wife. The woman's name was said to be Mary Gibbons, and the witness also testified that Washington kept her at a house and he came there very often, late at night, in disguise. A second witness alleged Gibbons was a spy who was sleeping with Washington in order to copy top-secret documents from him while he slept. That's a fast copier. However, records suggest that both the witnesses and the mistress were completely fabricated. Also, George was with Martha in New York at the time the alleged liaisons were supposed to be happening, and he never left her in the night for any secret business. After her husband had spent 8 years away from her during the Revolutionary War, Martha Washington was less than happy to learn that he was then going to serve as president. Martha was the kind of woman who was not shy about expressing her displeasure, and in a letter to her brother she wrote that she was truly sorry to tell him of George's victory in the election. She also added that she felt it was much too late for him to go into public life again. Feeling as she did, Martha didn't willingly accept her role as First Lady. The formal dress, weekly receptions, and constant socializing were all difficult adjustments for her. She even complained to her niece that she felt more like a state prisoner than anything else. Martha Washington contributed a literal fortune to her marriage, catapulting George Washington right to the top of Virginian high society. Not only was Martha acutely aware of how much she helped her husband get ahead, she apparently made sure no one else ever forgot that fact either. According to reports, Martha did not fit our stereotyped image of the deferential 18th century wife. Rather, she was strong-willed and insisted upon being heard. And when we say insisted, we mean it. Martha was a foot shorter than George, so when she wanted his attention, she would simply yank on his collar, forcing him to look her in the eye. Whether she needed this unusually insistent and perhaps aggressive tactic is unclear, but records do indicate that George respected his wife's opinions, or pretended to save his collars. Washington wasn't merely the winning general in the Revolutionary War and the first president of the United States, he was also a booze maker. Yes, Washington owned a distillery that eventually became one of the largest producers of whiskey in the country. His brand was so popular that he could pay his family doctor and farm employees with bottles of the hooch. By the time Washington died in 1799, Mount Vernon's distillery had produced somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,000 gallons of whiskey from rye and corn grown on their own fields. Whiskey wasn't the only thing Washington was making on his plantation estate. He also grew hemp on his land. The crop, which he grew for decades, would be made into ropes, cloth, and nets. And we know what you're thinking. For those wondering if General George liked to light up at 420, or have seen Slater's speech about George in Dazed and Confused, the answer is almost certainly no. Unlike modern recreational cannabis that contains 6 to 20% THC, the stuff Washington grew contained less than 0.03%. Even if he did light up a fatty, it was no bueno. While living in Philadelphia during the 1770s, Washington is said to have visited a local seamstress named, wait for it, Betsy Ross. He just needed her to embroider ruffles on his shirts, but she must have done a hell of a job. because according to legend, he returned in June of 1776 looking for something slightly more important, a flag for a new country. The legend holds that Washington showed Ross a drawing of a flag with 6-pointed stars. Ross, it said, took one look and suggested 5-pointed stars because they were easier to make. It's a fun story, but historians doubt it, since it was first circulated by one of Ross's own descendants 100 years after it supposedly happened. Father of Your Country is a pretty impressive sounding title, but nearly as impressive is Washington's other title, Father of the American Mule. Yes, after receiving a prized Spanish donkey from the King of Spain, Washington became the first person in America to breed mules. It was 1785 when the donkey first arrived at Mount Vernon, named Royal Gift, who the general described as too full of royalty to have anything to do with the plebeian race. But apparently hard up for a good book to read, Washington kept at it, and by 1799 he had 63 mules at Mount Vernon. Why was Washington so determined to build his mule supply? Was he just trying to avoid Martha? No, he was doing it for America, of course. He believed mules, which required less feed than horses, would revolutionize farming and save farmers money. Turns out, he was right, although it's also possible he was avoiding Martha.